Welcome to another episode of the Star Local Media High School Sports Podcast. My name is Matt Welch, being joined by Devin Hasson. Just a two-man show today. David Woolman has a prior engagement. So, yeah, Devin, you and I will be holding down the ship as we continue our high school football season preview. This is part two of a 5-part series, as we've come up with 20 questions that will define the coverage for Star Local Media for high school football this season. We knocked out the first 4 last week, so let's talk 4 more questions today. And why waste any time, man? Let's jump right into it. Let's first off, for this first question, let's go and put ourselves back in February, back during simpler times.
Yeah, it seems like an eternity ago.
I know, goodness. But yes, let's put ourselves right back in the shoes of where we were for realignment, when we got to see what the new districts were going to look like, and just where the dominoes fell as far as laying the groundwork for the upcoming athletics year. So the first question is, all right, so let's see. What were the biggest changes brought on by realignment for our football programs? Obviously, again, it's realignment, so you know that there's going to be some curveballs thrown as far as teams being put in districts that they otherwise didn't anticipate, teams moving up and down classifications. Every 2 years, the deck changes as far as what we have to cover. So in your area, Devin, what were, I guess, some of the biggest takeaways, and which schools were most gravely impacted by realignment?
Well, my 6A schools, there was not a lot of changes. There wasn't expected to be a lot of changes outside of their number, I guess. The Garland ISD with 7 schools, they are a package deal, and with Wiley bordering GISD, it just makes geographic sense to put them as the 8th team. No changes really for the Mesquite ISD schools as well, with one notable change. Longview dropped down to Class 5A, and they were replaced by Skyline. But I guess, in looking at that 6A, I guess the biggest change is the playoffs. Because, in years past, the Garland school has been matched up with the Allen, Plano, Prosper district, which, depending on who you drew there, was a tough matchup. Certainly no one wanted to face Allen or here recently Prosper. And so instead, those two, the Garland ISD and the Mesquite ISD districts, are matched up in the first round. The other kind of curveball that the Region 2, I guess, got is the area round matchup, because now all of a sudden, out from Region 1 comes the Duncanville, DeSoto, Cedar Hill behemoth district, and so that's going to make things, and not to mention that 12-6A, it's the Killeen schools, Waco Midway, a lot of good programs there as well, Temple. So it's going to be interesting to see over these next 2 years if any of the Garland ISD or Mesquite ISD teams are going to be able to make kind of an extended run, because that second round matchup most likely is going to be a beast. And
I'm at least glad that they were able to at least keep the region somewhat balanced, because I wonder when the last time DeSoto, Duncanville, those schools were in Region 2.
It's been a while. I'd have to do some serious research, but I just kind of going through my inventory on recent playoff games. I can't remember the last time. DeSoto for a while was, but I can't remember the last time Duncanville was in that group.
Because I'm just so used to whenever we've had to cover, the Allen and Plano schools being in Region 1, it always came with the cachet of having to go against the Duncanvilles and the DeSotos and the Cedar Hills and whatnot. So to at least, if you're going to take away Allen, Prosper, move them into one region, but then shift over, Duncanville, DeSoto, at least keeps the region somewhat balanced. Because that was the thing where, in years past, you would have just so much talent over in that first region. So and obviously, with Plano ISD, Allen, Prosper, McKinney ISD making the move back to Region 1. I remember back in February. The first thing that my eyes always gravitate towards whenever they put the districts up on the projector up at the Birdville Athletic Complex, always trying to find out where Plano ISD and Allen are going to be, and then just the shockwave just with between just with me, but with the coaches that were nearby, when you see for the first time in 20 plus years that Allen and Plano ISD are no longer in the same district, and just the surprise of all that, just because it's just something that again, the UIL always throws curveballs, and it's a fool's errand to try to make any sort of conjecture as to what they're going to eventually come up with. But just given the proximity of those schools, just the continuity, again, they share the same district for over 2 decades, and just the fact that it's the 4 largest schools in the state by a considerable margin. everything has always pointed to like that just always seemed like one of the first things. Like, okay, well, what are we going to do? Okay, just might as well keep Allen and Plano ISD together. Why break that apart? But yeah, I mean, obviously with Little Elm and Braswell moving up to 6A, you knew that there was going to be at least some potential for some sort of shakeup. It was just a question of where the UIL decided to kind of draw that line as far as who went where with, because you also have to factor in, Louisville ISD, Capel, Denton ISD, Prosper, McKinney ISD, and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, all those schools are still within. They're half of them are in one district and half of them are in the other. It's going to be the first time in a while that Allen and PISD are apart. As far as what it means in a football sense, I mean, with Allen, it's still going to be a really, really talented district over in 5-6A. Between Allen and Denton Geyer and Prosper, it feels like those three have kind of, and not just in football, but in all sports, those three figure to kind of occupy, those 4 playoff spots in some capacity. And then it's a matter of whoever kind of gets hot between those McKinney schools and Braswell, if they're able to make some headway. I know they were coming off a really, really strong year down in 5A. And then Little Elm, which is, got the smallest enrollment and, a school that might be, in some sports at least, probably going to be a little overmatched. But, we'll see. But yeah, with Allen, Geyer, Prosper, that's a loaded district at the top. And even though with Plano ISD, they're no longer in the shadow of Allen. I mean, a school that, Allen had beaten Plano ISD every year in football, swept them entirely every year since 2005. I mean, so it's just been...
not even an upset every now and again, huh?
There were years where, Plano came close, back in 2012, I want to say. East put a scare in Allen a few times along the way, but no one was ever able to get over the hump. Allen always found a way in the end. But yes, so there's no longer that boogeyman of sorts, but there's still, Louisville ISD has just got so many quality programs. Marcus, the reigning district champion, they're one of the best teams in the area. Louisville has just about its entire offense back, so much firepower, in that offense. Flower Mound is 2 years removed from winning a district title. Hebron feels like Hebron's made the playoffs every year that I've been here. And Capel, they just had a 7-year playoff streak snapped last season. So, even though it's, again, you're out of the shadow of Allen, I don't know necessarily that the landscape has changed a whole lot for the better for Plano ISD's sake. But then you look elsewhere and, you see the schools that, kind of went up and down, fluctuated classifications. Obviously, we just mentioned Little Elm making the move to, to Class 6A. Then you had teams like, Frisco Reedy going, from 5A D2 up to 5A D1 to that loaded district that we talked about last week as being the best district in our coverage area with 6 teams that made the playoffs last season, including the top 2 ranked teams in the state in Lone Star and Denton Ryan. Teams like Poteet and Creekview, though, they were able to, get a little bit of a change of scenery in making the move down from 5A D1 to 5A D2. I don't know how, what the mindset is over at Poteet right now as far as their chances of, making a run and winning a district title. But with Creekview, at least, it's far more manageable just because, in, these last couple of years, they were in the same district as Denton Ryan and then Birdville, Grapevine, Colleyville Heritage, all teams that went on to make pretty significant playoff runs. And there was just this glass ceiling there for these last couple of years. So with, with Creekview being with the Fort Worth ISD schools now, it feels like the schools that are a little bit more on their playing field as far as being able to generate some more competitive football than they have in the past.
Yeah, you mentioned Poteet a second ago. West Mesquite and Poteet have been in the same district since Poteet opened in 1990. This will be the first time that they've been separated, although they are playing in non-district. Yeah. But you talk about spitting 2 teams in 2 totally different directions. West Mesquite stays in Division I, and they get, this was in our conversation for toughest district, top to bottom, too, because they're now in with Longview and Highland Park and Tyler and McKinney North and a good Sherman team. Yeah. And with a first-year head coach, Frank Sandoval, and not having spring practice, it's going to be a real tough chore for West Mesquite this year. Meanwhile, Poteet drops back down to Division II. They get 8 new district mates, and they're all from Dallas ISD. Now, South Oak Cliff's going to be tough. They've been a good team year in, year out. Yeah. But a lot of those other teams are not traditionally strong. They make the play. Even the team that goes, 7-4 makes the playoffs is losing by 3, 4, 5 touchdowns in the first round of the playoffs. So Poteet goes from being in, possibly probably being an odd man out in 7-5A Division One to being a co-favorite or maybe a slight, runner-up south of cliff in terms of making the playoffs. So they have every reason to believe that they can win a district title this year.
And then there was also a neat development at the private school level as far as how TAPS handled its realignment. So these last couple of years, they decided to go with some small districts, and they basically split the Dallas area schools into 2 5-team districts. So it meant that, you were playing only 4 district games, 6 non-district, which is obviously the coaches weren't exactly the biggest fans of that sort of structure and whatnot. So they've decided to reunite the super district and make an 8-team district this year that has Prestonwood, John Paul, the defending state champion in Division I, Parish Episcopal, as well as All Saints, Nolan, Bishop Lynch, Argyle Liberty Christian, then Midland Christian. It just shakes out to a district that's going to be an absolute juggernaut, as it always is. The TAPS Division I state champion has come from the Dallas-Fort Worth area the last 12 years.
I believe it.
And just looking at kind of the way these teams stack up heading into this season, I like the chances of that streak extending to 13. So yes, that's a look at some of the ramifications from realignment in our coverage area. Let's move on to question number. Let's make question number 6, I would say, of our 20. And last week we devoted a question to breaking down some potential statistical leaders. We talked quarterbacks last week, so we're going to stay in the backfield and focus on the run game as far as which players could potentially lead Star Local Media's coverage area in rushing. I actually deferred kind of to the private school ranks again in this one. There's a few running backs there between John Paul, Prestonwood, even Prince of Peace over in Carrollton that that have some pretty stout talent in the backfield. The leading rusher among returners at the private school level in the Dallas-Fort Worth area is actually Prince of Peace's Devontae Knowlton, who had just shy of 1,800 rushing yards and 23 touchdowns last season. He's back, and he is the centerpiece of that offense. Then you've got at John Paul, Grant Robinson, and at Prestonwood, Randall Holmes, 2 running backs that they split carries last season, so their numbers aren't as jaw-dropping as Knowlton's. We're out of Prince of Peace, but the geometry has kind of changed for those teams in the offseason. One of the bigger developments at the private school level was the exodus of a few of the top players for John Paul after John Paul strung together its state runner-up campaign last season. Grayson James, their quarterback last year, he's now at Duncanville. Jaron Bradley, their top receiver, maybe the best receiver in TAPS, he's at DeSoto. They lost a few defensive...
Funny how that happens.
And they lost some standouts on the defensive side of the ball. So all of a sudden now they're going to be really young at quarterback and receiver, and that's going to put a bit more on the plate of someone like Robinson, who again he had 774 rushing yards last season, but that was with splitting carries with Carson Collins. This is a kid who's got experience playing high level varsity football since he was a sophomore. Remember, he transferred into John Paul from Allen, and he was used pretty heavily as a sophomore out of that backfield for the Eagles. So he's looking at a bit more of an expanded workload with the youth that's now all of a sudden going to be around him at quarterback and receiver. And the same thing with Randall Holmes at Prestonwood. He had 1,020 yards last season splitting carries with Timothy Taylor. And then, kind of the same case where Prestonwood projects to be a little bit younger, throughout its offense. So, that should at least open up some more opportunities to kind of lean on Holmes a bit to make some headway and improve upon his output from last season. At the public school level, there were a couple guys that jumped out, at least with Plano. I'm curious to see what happens with Tylen Hines this year. That was obviously one of the bigger coaching developments in the offseason was Plano bringing in Todd Ford and just that high-flying, wide-open offense that he's run over the years, with most recently at Lovejoy and whatnot. Tylen Hines is one of the most dynamic backs in our coverage area. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I know he averaged, close to 10 yards per carry last season. It fits right in the mold of what they had with Kyron Cumbie as far as just a kid who anytime the ball's in his hands, you get him in space, he's got the game-breaking ability to take it all the way. So depending on how they use him, again, this is another offense that they've got some experience at quarterback with Oliver Towns, but they graduated so much of the receiving core that it's going to kind of be the Towns-Hines show as far as dictating where that offense goes. And just given the Todd Ford offensive track record, I'm just kind of anxious to see it could be a pretty big year in store for Tylen Hines. And then, Jordan Johnson over at Allen kind of has a similar opportunity as far as a kid who, got to really step up late in the season and then really, really thrived with his responsibility last year as well.
Yeah, and real quick, I'll touch on a private school, Dallas Christian. T.J. King, he rushed for nearly 1,300 yards last year. He's a two-time district most valuable player, and so he'll certainly be up there with that in that group as well. You know, it's hard forecasting rushing leaders these days because everybody runs the spread.
Yeah, there weren't a ton from our coverage area last year.
Yeah, and so, you know, because of that, so then you kind of take a look at, well, who's breaking in a new quarterback? Will that mean that they're going to be more, run oriented early in the season? And then there's like you alluded to earlier, there's these teams that split carries. I mean, you see that. I mean, Rowlett has a pair of really good running backs in Dwayne Newton and Colton Yarborough, but they're likely going to split carries. Yeah. Sunnyvale, same thing. Saw watching them on Friday night. Obi Arinze and Alex Luna shared the touches. So it's really kind of hard to forecast. A couple weeks ago, I would have said Sean Coleman over at Saxe, but he is apparently not playing this season for Saxe. So, but they're really high. Coach Barron's is really high on Brian Okoye. Yeah. He averaged 6.6 yards per carry last year and limited touches, but showed what he can do. And now he's going to step in and be the man. So he's going to be one of those candidates just because at this point in time, he's going to be the go-to guy. Again, you look over at the Frisco schools. I mean, there's some good backs that rushed for between 600 and 800 yards last year. Jaden Nixon over at Lone Star and Jacob Smith at Reedy and Jared White at Wakeland. We'll be curious to see how they kind of incorporate them into the offense and if they kind of open them up a little bit more. Xavier Jeans at Poteet, he was the backup that filled in when Seth McGowan was going in and out of the lineup all last season, and he quietly rushed for 856 yards, even with taking a back seat to McGowan when he was playing. So now that he's the featured guy, he may be a guy to watch.
Let's see. Our next question, though, we go from talking about potential rushing leaders to talking some potential breakout candidates. Who are some potential breakout candidates in Star Local Media's coverage area? This is one that, the options are pretty limitless. Every team's going to have, some kids that just, whether it's, seeing a more expanded role or a kid that just kind of comes out of the woodwork that had a really strong offseason. Every team is going to have breakout candidates. As far as some ones that spring to mind, where did you kind of land on this one, Devin?
Well, I mentioned Brian Okoye. Now that he's been given but Saxe, the one I'd point out at Saxe is Alex Orji, who's scheduled to be their starting quarterback. If the Orji name sounds familiar, because he's the youngest of three brothers that all went to Rockwall. That's actually where Alex Orji started as a freshman. Then he transferred to Bishop Dunn. Then he transferred to Saxe. Was initially ruled ineligible by the DEC to play for transferring then, and then they got it cleared where he's a go. So obviously he comes from a family of great athletes that both his older brothers are playing college football. But again, he hasn't been in that system, and so again, we go back to the loss of spring practice. So he's going to kind of have to hit the ground running to see what he can do. North Mesquite has been a team that's endured some struggles, but when I saw them last year, Kobe Norman, their running back, was a nice-looking player that I think they can, build the offense around. Horn, Marquise Edwards, their defensive back, junior defensive back, I think he's going to emerge as one of the top prospects in the area. Just a really impressive kid. West Mesquite, Javian Jackson was called up to the varsity as a freshman last year, averaged 24 yards per catch, albeit very limited touches. But, if they can find somebody to get him the ball, he may be a guy to keep an eye on. And then a couple out in Frisco, Independence, Reggie Bush. I have to bring him up just because of his name, right?
Of course.
But they already have a quarterback in Braylon Braxton. But Reggie Bush averaged nearly 7 yards on 59 rushing attempts. And so that guy, he's certainly one to keep an eye on. And obviously Braylon Braxton, racks up his share yards on the ground as well. And then over at Reedy, AJ Padgett takes over the starting quarterback duties this year. In limited action last year, he completed 58% of his passes. But, Reedy's been able to churn out some good quarterbacks here in recent years, and he could be the next in line.
For me, I just mentioned him as a potential rushing leader. Didn't elaborate a ton because I wanted to do that for this question. Allen's Jordan Johnson is one that I stumbled on as far as a potential breakout. So Allen's backfield last year, they had a bunch of capable rushers. I want to say their top 5 rushers all averaged something to the tune of over 7 yards per carry by the end of the season. Really explosive backfield. Well, as the year went along, Johnson kind of emerged as their go-to guy. He was handed obviously a big opportunity though late in the season after a season-ending injury to their starter Sheldon Manning, and he thrived. I mean, he had that second round playoff game against Rockwall, just as exciting a game as that was. I mean, so much has been made about the performances of Jackson Smith and Jigba for Rockwall, and then Allen's quarterback Raylan Sharp. As far as just per touch dominance, Allen's Jordan Johnson had 7 touches for 188 yards and 3 touchdowns. He had he had an incredible game, obviously, and but just on the year, those last 4 games, what he was able to do after taking over as their starting running back, he finished the year as the team's leading rusher, albeit with just 763 yards. Again, it was a lot of backfield by committee, and again, he didn't really get most of that production until later in the season. But it's the yards per carry, 9.5, that should have Allen fans pretty encouraged heading into this season. And it's one of those where the circumstances will kind of dictate that maybe Allen leans a bit more on the run early on. Obviously, they got a ton of talent at wide receiver, but they got a brand new quarterback, whether it's Parker Wells, General Booty, who knows. They've also got a pretty experienced offensive line, which was not the case last year. So it's kind of setting up for Johnson to potentially build off of what he was able to accomplish last year. There were a couple names with Creekview that kind of jumped out too. Creekview, who we mentioned earlier, as far as a couple players that could be in for a bit more of an expanded role in the offense. Remember Creekview runs the flex bone, so a bit of a non-traditional offense compared to these spread-heavy sets in today's high school football. But Edgar Page and David Thompson are 2 names to kind of keep an eye on for Creekview. Obviously, Page, he split carries last year with Isaiah Pena. He averaged nearly 6 yards per carry out of the backfield, though ran for 575 yards. He's expected to be the bell cow, this year. So as far as what that responsibility entails, he's in line to kind of be the focal point of their rushing attack. And then Thompson, whether it's as a quarterback or as a slot receiver, head coach Jay Klein says he's going to still have some major role within that offense. Last year, again, he operated just as primarily as a slot receiver, and he only had, again, this is a team that only attempted 19 passes all season. I think he only caught 1 ball last year and whatnot. But if he is able to win that starting quarterback job, again, because it's the flexbone offense, it's not so much, what you're capable of, as far as throwing the ball, but as far as rushing opportunities. Their quarterback last year, Brett Esch, led the team in rushing attempts by a significant margin. So if Thompson is able to approximate that role, then yeah, he's in the opportunities that he did get to run last year, he had 28 carries and he averaged over 8 yards per carry. So could potentially add a bit more speed to the backfield than they've had in years past. But yeah, with Creekview, and also, statistically, you'd expect that offense is going to just perform better statistically just because they're in a much more reasonable district, and you're not those, you had half the games last year that were a bit more manageable, and then the other half were against the Denton Ryans, Grapevine, Birdvilles, and whatnot. And it's going to be tough when you're a run-based offense to make a whole lot of headway there. So there's definitely opportunities for Creekview to really, really thrive this season. And then the last one that another name out of the Carrollton area, Hebron's Weston Conaway. He's the quarterback, projected to be the starting quarterback this season, and it's more just kind of a belief in the track record at the position for Hebron, because you look over the past decade, and just in our coverage area, I'm not sure how many schools have had a more consistent run at the quarterback position than Hebron's had. Just recently with Carson Harris, before that Clayton Toon, and then earlier in the decade with Kyle Aubuchon and Joseph Farley, some really, really quality passers to come through that school. And they've always done a good job as far as getting whoever the backup is, making sure that kid gets to see some time early in the season, whether it's giving them, every 3 or 4 series, putting them out there just to get them comfortable, get their feet wet against a varsity offense, varsity defense, I should say, just so, and just to kind of just at least get them comfortable with the role, just so that when they're called upon next season, it's nothing that they aren't already a little bit familiar with. But you look at just the track record, 7 of the past 10 seasons, Hebron's quarterback has combined for more than 2,000 yards of offense, including the past 5. Again, Conaway got some time last year. He attempted 42 passes, which is pretty solid for a backup quarterback and whatnot. And also, he's got a receiving core that head coach Brian Brazel said maybe the deepest that he's ever had. Not just with if you're going to have a receiver to help kind of swell your pass production, might as well be one that averaged 27 yards per catch last season, and that's what Hebron has with Nick Frazier. Then they got Jedi Henry. He's got 18 yards per catch last season. Then their tight end Wesley Douglas, Nick Harris, Coda Bridges, younger brother of former district MVP Trajan Bridges, currently at Oklahoma. They're going to use their two of their stud DBs, Vincent Miller, Mason Williamson on that side of the ball. They got a 6'3" move-in from Pittsburgh named Day Johnson. I mean, there's just a lot of potential there with that Hebron passing offense, and obviously, it lines up very well for Conaway to potentially build off what his predecessors have done at that position. Let's see. All right, so let's then close this out with our last of the 4 questions for today's episode. Who are some teams that missed the playoffs a year ago that we expect to make the postseason this year? There's always a few teams that slip through the cracks that just missed out last year, then make the necessary adjustments in the offseason. Maybe they get a little bit more fortunate with health and whatnot, and are able to get over the hump. Kids just evolve and just kind of improve their play with maturity and whatnot. So, who are some candidates this year to have bounce back years that result in playoff berths?
I don't have many that fit that criteria, just because most of my teams that I predicted to make the playoffs this year were playoff teams a year ago. Mm-hmm. But 2 kind of stuck out to me. Rowlett had its run of 14 straight playoff appearances, which was a Garland ISD record. Ended on a tiebreaker. It was a 3-way tie for third, and point differential, and they were the odd man out. But Rowlett wasn't that far off. I mean, obviously, if the tiebreaker would have gone differently, they would have been a playoff team. Mm-hmm. But they also lost by 1 to Wiley and by 2 to Saxe, who were the 2 district champions. So Rowlett was right there. I mean, they had a quality team. Mm-hmm. They returned 11 starters. I mentioned their running back tandem, that should be good. If they can find a quarterback, that's going to be the biggest key, is breaking in a new signal caller. But with that ground game and with the number of starters they have back, on both sides of the ball, and in a district that's very evenly matched. I mean, there's not a dominant powerhouse there. Mm-hmm. Saxe isn't projected to be, the Saxe of 2-3 years ago, when no team could get close to him type stuff. Yeah. So I see Rowlett bouncing back and starting a new streak. The other one that as I was kind of researching this, Frisco Liberty, and which might sound really odd, seeing as they went 1-9 last season, and they haven't had a winning record since 2011. But their one win last season was in the season finale against Wakeland. Yeah, a Wakeland team that went to the playoffs. In that game, Will Glatch, their quarterback, was 22 of 25 for 325 yards and 3 touchdowns. Overall, he threw for nearly 1,900 yards and 13 touchdowns. He kind of got acclimated. Well, now he's back with a year of experience under his belt. They got a good running back in Jonathan Bone. Evan Stewart on the outside is one of the top receivers in the district, and they dropped down in class to Division II. So rather than having to contend with Lone Star and Denton Ryan and whatnot for one of those playoff spots, I mean, Frisco is certainly the team to beat in that district. Lovejoy is always tough. Dennison's going to have a good team. But, I think with the strides they made toward the end of the year, because they also had 2 3-point losses in district. Yeah. So they were competitive. So having the number of kids they have back, particularly at the skill positions, dropping down to a different district that's, a little bit more wide open, than not top heavy like, what they left. I think, even though they went 1-9 last season, I think Liberty's a team that can make the playoffs this year.
That doesn't seem at all far-fetched to me. That's a district that's far more manageable given kind of where that program is at. Let's see, where I landed on this, I'm looking for at least somebody who missed out last year in 6-6A to make it this year. And I guess it would probably be in place of a team like Flower Mound, which lost a ton on offense and still some quality players on that side of the ball. But, that's a program that certainly figures to take a little bit of a step back this year with how much younger they figure to be. And that could open the door for a team like Capel or potentially one of the Plano schools. Capel, especially a program that missed the playoffs last year. I think prior to last season, they'd only missed the playoffs once within the past decade. I mean, that's such a steady program. But last year was just, just to kind of, look back on it. Just, everything that could have gone wrong kind of did. I mean, they're already a young team that was up against it from an experience standpoint, but then you compound that with just so many health issues. It felt like every year the quarterback position was up for grabs as far as who was going to start, whether it was Kevin Schumann, Ryan Walker, and whatnot. So they're at least established right now for the time being with Walker entrenched as the starter, and there's a whole lot of continuity elsewhere. They've got their leading rusher back, Jason Ingwu. Anthony Black, their top receiver, is one of the top prospects in the area at that position, a stud on both the football field and the basketball court. He's got multiple D1 offers in both sports. Got Walker Polk back on defense. There's a ton of talent there still. So again, if they can just stay a bit healthier and whatnot, then it all points to a bounce back here. And they showed really well, even though they missed out. They took Marcus, the district champion, to overtime last season and whatnot. They still had some really, really talented results, despite, falling short of the playoffs. And then with Plano, I'm not sure which one right now. Again, obviously with Plano East and Plano West last year, you'd think that just, what are the odds that they both go 1-9 again? At least some improvement should be anticipated with those teams having a lot coming back this season. And again, like East was another team kind of like Capel that had a ton of just health issues and whatnot. West seemed to get better as the year went along and got more comfortable under their head coach Tyler Sukup. With Plano, they've been right on the doorstep these last couple of years. They missed out on the playoffs the last night of the regular season and whatnot. Now they said it's a brand new coaching staff, kind of a new era in Wildcat football. So as far as how long it'll take before they eventually realize their potential under Todd Ford remains to be seen. Like I said, they're set at quarterback and running back. Their receiver position, though, is going to be a bit something to monitor, though. And if you remember last season, where everything cratered for them late in the year, it was when they had all those injuries to their wide receivers and just couldn't overcome that. So it's a team that still, you'd probably say they're still maybe a little bit further ahead, though, of the other two, assuming that things like, getting their new schematics installed and whatnot wasn't too set back or hindered by the pandemic. But yeah, those two, I think either Capel, maybe Plano, one of those teams is going to make the playoffs next season after missing out last season. I look for at least one, maybe two teams from Carrollton Farmers Branch ISD to get in, as far as teams that could benefit from a bit of a brighter scenery now after realignment. We've already talked about Creekview being in a more manageable district. Well, the same goes for Newman Smith and R.L. Turner. They're still staying in Division One, but they're also out from underneath Denton Ryan, Grapevine, Birdville, Colleyville, Glass Ceiling, and they're in a district that has a head and shoulders favorite in Lancaster. No one's touching Lancaster in that district, but as far as second, third, fourth place, it's all up for grabs as they're in there with the rest of the Dallas ISD schools, all of whom, who knows, just how what their schedules have been like as far as preparations for the season. CFB ISD is at least practicing. Again, they're at least holding workouts and whatnot, but obviously I know that's still kind of an ongoing thing with the DISD schools, so who knows what that's going to mean as far as district play, happens and whatnot. But yes, I think it's far more reasonable to expect Newman Smith or Creekview to make the playoffs this season. R.L. Turner, new head coach coming off a winless season. It's probably a bridge too far right now, but at the very least, I feel like at least one of those Carrollton teams should be back in the mix. Let's see. That's I don't know. That's all I had.
I said my piece.
All right.
I couldn't come up with a third team. It's too big of a stretch on some of these.
So yes, that'll do it for this episode of the Star Local Media High School Podcast, High School Sports Podcast. We have 8 questions down. We got 12 more to go as we continue our high school football season preview, all leading up to late September. I believe, what is it? The 24th is the first night when 5A and 6A get going.
Yes,
should be fun. We've already got football happening right now. I actually have a game under my belt. I've got to see pandemic football in person. I was out watching Salina last week and whatnot. So, but yes, it's just catch the fever, folks. It's coming for those big schools. It is almost here. We get workouts going on Labor Day and whatnot. So yes, obviously in keeping with Labor Day next week, we'll continue the podcast next week, albeit on Tuesday. So until then, folks, you enjoy the rest of your week, and we will talk to y'all later.